It was supposed to be a routine drive. Justice Marcus Reed had just wrapped up a rare in-person lecture at the local law school, a surprise visit that had law students scrambling to take notes. It had gone longer than expected, and now he was cruising down a quiet road in his black Mercedes, dressed in a casual gray turtleneck and dark slacks, no driver, no entourage. Just a man enjoying a quiet ride home. The flashing red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror like a sudden storm. He calmly pulled over. The officer approached slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. Justice Reed glanced over, young, maybe late 20s, trying a little too hard to look authoritative. The officer rapped on the glass, and Marcus lowered the window. "You in a hurry, sir?" the cop asked with a smirk, hands resting on his belt like he was gearing up for something. "Not particularly," Marcus replied, his tone measured. "License and registration." Justice Reed handed both over without hesitation. The officer didn't even glance at them before chuckling to himself. "You know, it's usually the fancy cars that think they're above the speed limit." Marcus raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The officer leaned in slightly, scanning the interior, then eyed Marcus again. "You from around here?" "No," Marcus said plainly. "Just visiting." "Aha," the officer grinned. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle for me?" Marcus didn't move right away. He stared at the officer, his eyes calm and unreadable. Then, slowly, he opened the door and stepped out. The cop couldn't help himself. "What, someone important? Got a meeting with the mayor or something?" Marcus smiled faintly. "No," he said. "Something a little higher." The officer let out a short laugh. "A little higher, huh? What, governor's office? Senator?" Justice Marcus Reed didn't answer. He stood still, his posture composed, hands relaxed at his sides. There was no aggression, no defiance, just presence. And that, somehow, unsettled the officer more than shouting ever could. "Look," the cop said, trying to reassert control, "you were driving 10 over the limit. I don't care what kind of suit you've got on or what kind of car you're in, nobody's above the law." Marcus didn't flinch. "Neither am I suggesting that I am." The officer scanned the license again, this time with more intent. His brow furrowed. "Marcus Reed," there was a moment of hesitation in his voice. He flipped the ID over again. A small emblem on the federal identification caught his eye, a symbol not typically seen in local traffic stops. He blinked and looked again, his mouth suddenly dry. Then he looked up. "You said you're just visiting," the officer murmured. "What kind of work do you do?" "I sit on the bench," Marcus replied. "And not the kind in a courtroom gallery." The officer narrowed his eyes. "Wait. Bench as in, judge?" Marcus nodded. A silence settled between them, the weight of the moment thick in the air. The cop stepped back slightly, eyes flickering between the ID and the man standing before him. "You're not just a judge, are you?" Marcus tilted his head. "No, I've seen your name before," the officer stammered. "On rulings. Federal rulings. Supreme Court." There it was. His skin paled. The bravado drained from his voice, the officer's fingers trembled slightly as he held the ID like it was radioactive. "Justice Marcus Reed," he whispered under his breath. "Supreme Court." I didn't realize," Marcus remained calm, his expression unreadable. "You didn't ask." The cop's mind was racing. His casual sarcasm, the smirk, the power trip, it all replayed in his head like a slow-motion car crash. He'd treated this man like a nobody. And now, he was staring into the eyes of someone who held the power to define constitutional law in the United States. I apologize, Your Honor," he stuttered. "I didn't mean any disrespect." "You didn't have to," Marcus replied smoothly. "It came through anyway." The cop's throat tightened. "I didn't know who you were." That's the problem, Marcus said, stepping closer. You thought not knowing gave you permission to treat me however you wanted. The officer opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was no excuse that didn't sound like an excuse. Justice Reed looked out over the road, then back at the young man. What if I hadn't been a judge? Would this have gone differently? There was no answer. The silence said enough. Then Marcus reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek leather cardholder. He slid out a second ID, this one unmistakable. The Supreme Court insignia gleamed under the light. I'm not showing you this to pull rank, he said. I'm showing you this because people need to be reminded that dignity isn't earned by titles, it's owed by default. The officer looked like he wanted the ground to open beneath him. The officer stood frozen, eyes locked on the Supreme Court ID like it might catch fire. His jaw clenched, then released, then clenched again. He clearly wanted to speak, but nothing was coming out. Justice Reed tucked the card back into his coat pocket, then adjusted his sleeves with slow precision. Every movement was deliberate, controlled. The kind of poise that only came from decades of being underestimated, and rising above it every time. You know, Marcus began, voice low but firm, I give lectures to law enforcement cadets every year. Talks on constitutional rights. Judicial accountability. The relationship between justice and discretion. The officer looked down at his boots, shame written all over his face. I usually start by saying, treat everyone with the same respect you'd show the Chief Justice. He paused. Seems I should start earlier next year. The cop's voice was barely audible. I didn't mean any harm, sir. Marcus tilted his head slightly. But you did cause harm. Harm doesn't require intention. Just assumption. A passing car whooshed by in the distance, filling the silence that followed. The sound somehow made the tension even heavier. Let me ask you this, Marcus continued. If I had pushed back, if I'd been less calm, would you have escalated? The officer swallowed hard. I don't know. That's the most honest thing you've said so far, Marcus said. And it's exactly why training alone isn't enough. It has to be paired with humility. You don't get to guess your way through encounters with people. That's how lives get ruined. The young officer nodded quickly, almost robotically. His face had gone from smug to sick. Justice Reed looked at the cruiser, then at the badge. Name? C. Cooper. Officer Ryan Cooper. Marcus gave him a long look. Officer Cooper, I'm not going to report this. The cop blinked. But I'm going to remember it. Officer Cooper looked like he'd just been handed a sentence without a courtroom. He stood in stunned silence, shifting uncomfortably as Justice Reed stepped away from him and returned to his car. The Mercedes door opened with a quiet click. Marcus paused before getting in. You should consider this a gift, he said, not turning around. Most people you pull over don't get the opportunity to teach you a lesson that might actually stick. Cooper nodded, eyes still on the ground. Yes, sir. Marcus glanced at him one last time. Don't, sir, your way out of accountability. Just do better. With that, he eased into the driver's seat and started the engine. Cooper remained frozen in place, watching as the luxury car pulled away and disappeared down the road. His own reflection stared back at him in the driver's side mirror of his cruiser, and it didn't look as confident as it had just 10 minutes ago. He knew something had shifted. Not just in how he saw that man, but in how he now saw himself. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something he hadn't expected to learn today. The next morning, Officer Cooper sat alone in the precinct's break room, staring at a blank notepad. He'd barely slept. He wasn't thinking about citations, patrol routes, or morning briefings. He was thinking about a quiet man in a gray turtleneck who had said more with silence than most did with a megaphone. By noon, Cooper had requested a meeting with his supervisor, not out of fear, but responsibility. I need better training, he said. Not just the legal kind. The human kind. Bias, assumption, judgment, I need to unlearn a lot more than I thought. The supervisor, surprised but impressed, asked what brought this on. Cooper just said, a conversation I shouldn't have needed, but I'm grateful I had. Meanwhile, across the city, Justice Marcus Reed returned to his chambers, greeted with the usual stack of briefings and a mountain of opinions to review. But he sat for a moment longer than usual at his desk, his fingers steepled under his chin. That night, he added a new section to his next lecture for police cadets: respect should never depend on recognition. And power doesn't come from a title, it comes from how you choose to treat someone when you think no one's watching. He would deliver that lesson dozens of times over the next year. And in a small precinct across town, Officer Cooper would carry it with him every time he approached a car window, no matter who was inside. Months later, Officer Cooper stood before a new class of recruits at the academy. He wasn't there to lecture them on tactics or traffic codes. He was invited to speak about discretion, presence, and perception. He told them the story, but without names, ranks, or titles. He spoke about how he nearly let a uniform and badge blind him to the humanity in someone else. How he laughed at a man he didn't understand. How that man didn't yell, didn't fight, he simply revealed the truth. And that truth, Cooper said, was that the way I treated him said more about me than about him. The room was silent. One recruit finally asked, "What happened to him?" Cooper smiled faintly. "He drove off, like it never happened. But I carried the moment with me. Still do." And somewhere across the country, Justice Marcus Reed, now revered not only for his rulings but for his quiet strength, continued shaping the law, and lives. Not with a gavel, but with grace. A few weeks after the encounter, Justice Marcus Reed received an unexpected call. "Justice Reed, this is Officer Ryan Cooper. I hope I'm not crossing any lines reaching out directly." Marcus leaned back in his leather chair. "Go ahead, officer." There was a pause. Then Cooper's voice came through with more clarity, more weight. "I wanted to thank you, not for letting me off the hook, but for not letting me stay blind. That moment changed how I see people, and myself." Marcus was silent for a moment, then said, "Growth doesn't come from avoiding mistakes. It comes from confronting them." "Yes, sir. I've enrolled in new training, and I've started mentoring younger officers too. I just thought you should know, what you said didn't go to waste." Marcus allowed himself a rare smile. Then it was worth the stop. They ended the call. No ceremony, no applause. Just mutual understanding. Because sometimes the most important verdicts don't happen in courtrooms. They happen on the side of the road, between two people, when one finally sees the other clearly. The encounter between Officer Cooper and Justice Marcus Reed was never posted online. No viral video. No sensational headlines. But somehow, the story began to spread. First, through quiet whispers at the academy. Then, through informal briefings, officers referencing the stop that didn't make the news but changed a cop. Soon, it became part of unofficial training materials, retold in community workshops and leadership seminars. "Remember the judge on the side of the road," instructors would say. "Remember that every person you meet might be carrying more than you see." Marcus never once sought credit. He never mentioned the incident in interviews or speeches. But he noticed the shift, subtle but real. One day, during a private roundtable with other justices, someone brought it up. "I heard a young officer somewhere down south completely revamped his precinct's culture." The story was interesting. Marcus simply nodded and replied, "Sometimes the smallest trials deliver the most justice." And he meant it. Because the story was no longer about him. It was about what happens when someone chooses humility over ego. Respect over assumption. And growth over pride. Years passed. Justice Marcus Reed sat quietly in his study, surrounded by shelves of books, court transcripts, and framed memories of a life spent in pursuit of fairness. But one memory stood out, without a plaque, a headline, or even a record. A roadside conversation under flashing lights. It had started with a smirk, and ended with a shift. Not just in one officer, but in a culture that desperately needed reminders of restraint, decency, and dignity. He thought about the irony. The countless court rulings he had written. The national debates he'd helped shape. The legal doctrines he'd cemented into history. And yet, one of the most impactful moments of his legacy was never written down. He leaned back in his chair, watching the city lights flicker through the tall windows. A quiet thought drifted across his mind: true justice doesn't always need a bench. Sometimes, it just needs someone to pause, and choose to see. With that, he closed the case file in front of him, turned off the desk lamp, and let the night take him. Back at his precinct, Officer Cooper wasn't the same man he used to be. His colleagues noticed the shift. He listened more, talked less. He didn't rush. He didn't posture. One afternoon, a rookie officer rushed in, irritated after a tense traffic stop. They were mouthy. Thought they were somebody important, the rookie muttered. I shut that down real quick. Cooper looked up from his desk. Did you? He asked calmly. The rookie blinked. Yeah. Why? Cooper stood up and walked over. Let me tell you a story, he said. About a man I once stopped who didn't look the part, but turned out to be one of the most important people I've ever met. He didn't say, Supreme Court. He didn't name drop. He told the story the way it mattered most, about assumptions, about respect, about the danger of letting ego guide your badge. By the time he finished, the room was silent. That rookie didn't say a word. And from that day on, he watched Cooper more carefully. He wasn't the only one. Years later, Justice Marcus Reed's time on the Supreme Court quietly came to a close. No drama, no press tour, just a heartfelt statement, a final opinion, and a humble exit from the bench. He had written landmark decisions. Defended the Constitution. Inspired thousands. But to him, true justice had never been about rulings, it had been about reach. Meanwhile, Officer Ryan Cooper had risen through the ranks, not because of arrests or citations, but because of leadership. He implemented new programs, de-escalation workshops, community listening sessions, peer accountability forums. He never named the moment that had sparked it all. But every now and then, during late-night reflections or quiet rides home, he thought of the man in the gray turtleneck. And silently, he thanked him. One morning, a letter arrived at Marcus Reed's doorstep. Handwritten. No title, no return address, just a simple name at the bottom, Ryan Cooper. Inside was a short message: you changed me more in 5 minutes than any academy ever did. I teach that lesson every day. You may have stepped down, but your verdict still echoes. Marcus folded the letter, smiled faintly, and placed it in his desk drawer, among his most treasured keepsakes. Because while the world might remember him as a Supreme Court justice, one man would always remember him as the stranger who handed him a second chance, without ever raising his voice.